The scent of a room changes when it is empty. It is not something you notice immediately, not until the subtle, familiar fragrances of fabric, aged leather, and carefully preserved silk are violently stripped away, leaving behind only the sterile, echoing chill of bare drywall and exposed wood. I did not know this until the day I walked back into my own home, dropped my suitcase onto the hardwood floor, and found my sanctuary entirely gutted. But the true horror of that moment did not begin with the empty hangers clicking against each other in the draft from the vent. It began 3 days earlier, on a brightly lit screen, thousands of miles away. To understand the absolute devastation of what happened, you have to understand the silent, suffocating war that had been raging in my home for the better part of 2 years. Vespra, my mother-in-law, was a woman who waged her battles not with raised voices or shattered glass, but with 1,000 imperceptible cuts. She was a master of the invisible slight, the plausible deniability of a misplaced word, the accidental destruction of things I held dear. When Torin and I moved into the sprawling, multi-generational home he had inherited, it was under the strict agreement that Vespera would retain the guest wing. At the time, I was naive. I believed in the sanctity of boundaries, in the pressed idea that reasonable adults could coexist if they respected closed doors. I had no idea that to Vespera, a closed door was an insult, a personal affront to her, supreme authority over the territory she considered rightfully hers. Torin was blind to it, not maliciously, but with the willful ignorance of a son who has never had to navigate the razor-sharp edges of his mother's planers and Lonner. Psychological warfare. To him, Vespera was just particular. She was just old-fashioned. He did not see the way her eyes would sweep over my outfits. Before a dinner party, her lips pressing together in a thin, bloodless line as she offered a compliment so backhanded it left a bruise. My closet was my only true refuge. It was not merely a space for storage, it was a physical manifestation of my independence, my history, and my survival. I had grown up with very little, wearing threadbare hand-me-downs that never quite fit. Every garment in that walk-in closet represented a milestone. There was the pristine, tailored cashmere trench coat I bought with my first major promotion. There was the delicate, hand-embroidered velvet shawl that had belonged to my late grandmother, the fabric carrying the faint, lingering memory of jasmine and old paper. There was an entire collection of vintage silk dresses I had, meticulously sourced over a decade, each one an investment, a piece of wearable art. Vespera despised my wardrobe. She viewed it as an ostentatious display of frivolity, a rebellion against the austere, monochromatic aesthetic she imposed on the rest of the house. More than once, I had returned home from work to find the door to my bedroom left slightly ajar, a faint, metallic scent of Vespera's signature perfume hanging in the air near my closet. When confronted, she would offer a serene, entirely unbothered smile, claiming she was merely looking for extra linens or checking for dust. The paranoia began slowly, a creeping frost that settled over my daily life. It wasn't just the closet. Small things began to shift. A delicate porcelain figurine on my vanity would be turned backward. A favorite pair of earrings would migrate from my jewelry box to the bathroom counter. It was a calculated campaign of disorientation, designed to make me feel like a stranger in my own home, a temporary guest who was overstaying her welcome. The breaking point arrived 6 months before the incident. A fragile, silver-like heirloom necklace, a piece of jewelry that had survived 2 generations of my family, vanished from my velvet-lined drawer. I tore the room apart. I sobbed in frustration, crawling on my hands and knees with a flashlight, checking every crevice of the floorboards. Vespera watched me from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of manufactured pity. She suggested, in a voice dripping with mock sympathy, that perhaps I was becoming forgetful, that my demanding career was taking a toll on my memory. Torin tried to comfort me, replacing the necklace with a beautiful, expensive diamond piece, completely missing the point. It wasn't about the monetary value. It was about the erasure of my history. That was the week I purchased the camera. It was a tiny, innocuous device, expertly concealed within the decorative mesh of a vintage radio speaker sitting on the highest shelf of my closet. I told myself it was for peace of mind. I told myself that if I could just prove I wasn't losing my mind, the suffocating anxiety would lift. I wired it directly into the home's hidden electrical lines so it would never need charging, and I synced it to a secure, encrypted application on my phone. The camera captured the entire expanse of the walk-in closet, from the rows of hanging dresses to the built-in shoe displays. It had motion detection, night vision, and an audio feed so sensitive it could pick up the sound of a moth brushing against the Ferdia Lavin. Drywall. For months, the camera captured nothing but my own morning routines. I watched myself select outfits, rushing to get dressed, completely oblivious to the unblinking digital eye hidden in the corner. Slowly, the vigilance faded. The app on my phone was relegated to the back pages of my home screen. I began to relax, convincing myself that the missing necklace had been a fluke, a genuine accident of my own making. Then came the winter symposium. My firm was sending me to a summit across the ocean, a high-stakes, week-long conference that required weeks of exhaustive preparation. The tension in the 70s house leading up to my departure was palpable. Vespera seemed unusually chipper, her steps light, her demeanor almost celebratory. It set my teeth on edge, but I was too overwhelmed with packing and flight details to analyze her sudden change. In mood. On the morning of my departure, a heavy gray sleet was beating against the windows. Torin helped me carry my luggage to the foyer, kissing my forehead and promising to water the plants in my office. Vespera stood at the top of the sweeping wooden staircase, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan. She did not come down to say goodbye. She merely stared down at me, her eyes dark and unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Have a productive trip," she called out, her voice echoing in the large space. "Take your time. Do not worry about a thing here. I will take care of the house. I will take care of everything." A cold shiver raced down my spine, entirely unrelated to the draft slipping beneath the front door. There was a finality in her tone, a strange, triumphant undercurrent that I could not pinpoint. But the airport taxi was honking in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the freezing rain, and I had no time to decipher the riddles of a bitter woman. I forced a polite smile, told Torin I loved him, and stepped out into the storm. The flight was grueling. 14 hours of recycled air, turbulence, and lighted id. Restless attempts to sleep in a cramped, upright position. By the time I touched down in the foreign city, my body ached, and my mind was clouded with a thick fog of jet lag. The hotel was a towering structure of glass and steel, entirely impersonal, a sharp contrast to the familiar, albeit tense, warmth of my home. I unpacked my minimal travel wardrobe, organized my presentation notes, and threw myself into the brutal schedule of the conference. For the first 2 days, my days were a blur of handshakes, glaring projector screens, and catered dinners where I forced myself to smile and engage in endless networking. The distance from the house felt like a physical relief. I didn't have to monitor my tone, I didn't have to guard my belongings, and I didn't have to endure Vespera's suffocating presence. It was the afternoon of the third day. I was sitting in the back row of a dimly lit auditorium, listening to a keynote speaker drone on about market fluctuations. The air conditioning was brutally cold, and the rhythmic sound of the speaker's voice was lulling me into a state of drowsy hypnosis. Deep inside the pocket of my blazer, my phone buzzed. It was not the long, continuous vibration of a phone call, nor the brief, sharp pulse of a text message. It was a specific, rhythmic vibration, a sequence of 3 short, erratic bursts. My heart seized in my chest. I had programmed custom vibrations for different applications years ago, an organizational habit to keep me from checking my 12 screen during meetings. That specific sequence was tied to only one app, the security application, the motion detector in my closet. I slipped my hand into my pocket, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the phone. Reason argued with my rising panic. It could be Torin, looking for a misplaced tie or an old document. It could be a trick of the light, a heavy shadow cast by a passing cloud triggering the sensor. But a primal, instinctual dread had already taken root in my stomach. I carefully withdrew the phone, keeping it shielded under the edge of my notebook, and tapped the screen to wake it. The notification banner sat stark and bright against the lock screen. Motion. Detected in primary wardrobe, 3:14 p.m. Given the time difference, it was shortly after breakfast back home. Torin would already be at his architectural firm. He never came home for lunch. My thumb hovered over the notification. My breath hitched, a sudden sharp intake of air that drew a side eye from the colleague sitting next to me. I ignored him, my vision tunneling, focusing entirely on the glowing pixels of the proster screen. I tapped the alert, my phone silently launching the encrypted application. The screen went black for an agonizing 3 seconds as it connected to the secure server. Then, the live feed flickered onto the screen. The camera angle provided a sweeping, top-down view of the walk-in closet. The morning light was pouring in through the frosted skylight, illuminating the porting section lay. Meticulous rows of my clothing. At first glance, everything looked still. And then, she stepped into the frame. Bispera. She wasn't just standing there. She wasn't simply passing through or looking for a stray item. She was carrying a massive, heavy-duty black trash bag, the thick plastic rustling audibly through the sensitive microphone, a terrible, tearing sound that seemed to slice straight through my eardrums. I sat frozen in the crowded auditorium, thousands of miles away, completely paralyzed as I watched my mother-in-law systematically, ruthlessly, begin to dismantle my life. She moved with terrifying efficiency, a woman entirely unburdened by guilt or hesitation. She walked straight to the back of the closet to the cedar-lined section where I kept my most precious items. She didn't inspect them. She didn't fold them. She reached out, her pale hands gripping the velvet hangers, and began violently yanking the garments down. Through the screen, I watched in silent horror as she grabbed the tailored cashmere trench coat, the one that symbolized my first real taste of success. She bunched the exquisite, soft fabric in her fists, crushing it without a second thought, and shoved it brutally into the black plastic bag. My chest tightened so painfully I felt as though my ribs were cracking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach through the glass of the screen and grab her wrists. Next came the vintage silk dresses. She didn't even bother removing them from their protective garment bags. She tore them from the rail in massive clumps, the hangers clattering loudly against the wooden shelves. She stuffed them down into the bag, pressing her knee into the plastic to compress the delicate fabrics, making room for more destruction. She was humming. I turned the volume up slightly, pressing the speaker of the phone tightly against my ear, ignoring the confused stares of the people around me in the render conference hall. The audio was crystal clear. Vespera was humming a cheerful, upbeat classical melody, a sickening soundtrack to her calculated vandalism. Her face, caught in the high-definition lens of the hidden camera, bore an expression of serene, absolute bliss. She looked like a gardener happily weeding a flower bed, completely content in her task of eradication. Tears, hot and blinding, welled in my eyes, blurring the screen. I wiped them away furiously, a rising tide of pure, unadulterated rage overriding the shock. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was an execution. I watched as she moved to the shelving unit holding my grandmother's hand-embroidered velvet shawl. It was wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, resting inside an archival box. Vespera opened the box, pulled out the tissue, and let it flutter to the floor. She held up the shawl, the intricate silver threading, catching the morning light. For a split second, she paused, looking at it. I prayed, in that agonizing millisecond, that some shred of human decency would stop her. Instead, a cruel, mocking smile curled her lips. She balled the priceless family heirloom up like a piece of dirty laundry and tossed it into the trash bag, alongside my work blouses and designer skirts. The first bag was full. She tied a harsh, tight knot at the top, dragged it out of the camera's frame, and immediately returned with an empty one. I realized then, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that she was not just ruining a few items. She was emptying the entire closet. She was erasing my physical footprint from the house, wiping me away as if I had never existed. My fingers trembled violently as I exited the live feed and opened my messaging app. I pulled up Torin's contact. My thumbs flew across the keyboard, making frantic typos as I tried to articulate the sheer scale of the emergency. Call me now. Emergency. Your mother is in my closet. I hit send. Then, I deleted it. I stopped breathing for a moment, my thumb hovering over the backspace key. Sudden, terrifying clarity washed over me, a cold wave that extinguished the immediate fire of my panic. If I called Torin now, what would happen? He would call his mother. Vespra would immediately stop. She would fabricate a lie. She would claim she was taking them to the dry cleaners, or that she found moth damage and was trying to save my things, or worse, she would hide the bags and claim I was having a paranoid delusion. Torin, desperate to keep the peace, would believe her. He would soothe me over the phone, tell me I was overreacting to the stress of my trip, and Vespra would retreat into the shadows, aware that she was being watched, only to strike again in a way I could never prove. No, screaming from a distance would not save my clothes. They were already crushed, violated, thrown into the dark abyss of a garbage bag. But screaming would ruin the one advantage I had. She didn't know I was watching. She believed she was operating in total secrecy, executing a flawless crime with zero witnesses. She was exposing her true, monstrous self to the unblinking eye of a camera she had no idea existed. I slowly lowered my phone. The keynote speaker at the front of the hall was concluding his presentation, a smattering of polite applause rippling through in the room. The sound felt surreal, completely disconnected from the catastrophic reality unfolding in my hand. I opened the security app again. I tapped the record icon. A small, red blinking dot appeared in the top corner of the screen. I was no longer just a victim watching my own life be dismantled. I was archiving the evidence. For the next 45 minutes, I sat in silence in the back of that auditorium, recording every second of Vespra's rampage. I watched as she systematically cleared every hanger, every shelf, and every drawer. I watched, then her sweep my shoes into heavy cardboard boxes. I recorded the moment she stood back, wiped her hands together in a gesture of a job well done, and surveyed the completely stripped, barren walls of my wardrobe. The closet was dead. My belongings were gone. I saved the video file, synced it to 3 different cloud servers, and slowly stood up from my chair. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was sharper, colder, and more dangerously focused than it had ever been in my entire life. Vespra had wanted a war. She had fired the first shot, believing me to be unarmed and thousands of miles away. She had no idea the arsenal I was about to bring home. The walk back to my hotel room was a masterclass in dissociation. The bustling, foreign streets, the blaring taxi horns, the humid scent of roasted street food, none of it penetrated the thick, impenetrable glass of my absolute focus. I moved mechanically, my hand remaining firmly plunged deep inside my coat pocket, my fingers tracing the hard edges of the phone that now held the digital execution of my mother-in-law. When I finally reached my suite, I slid the deadbolt into place, dropped my briefcase onto the unmade bed, and collapsed into the armchair by the window. For a long, silent hour, I did not cry. The time for weeping over crushed silk and stolen heirlooms had evaporated the placed moment I pressed the record button. What replaced the sorrow was something far more potent, a cold, crystalline anger that sharpened my senses and slowed my percentage heartbeat to a steady, predatory rhythm. I needed to know where the bags went. Vespra was malicious, but she was not stupid. She would not leave 4 massive, bulging garbage bags of luxury clothing sitting in the garage where Torin could accidentally discover them. She needed to dispose of the evidence quickly and cleanly. I pulled up my phone again, my fingers steady now, and bypassed the hidden closet camera application, opening instead the standard smart home security system Torin had installed years ago. He used it primarily to monitor package deliveries on the front porch, but there was a secondary camera angled directly over the wide, sweeping curve of our driveway. I scrolled the timeline back to exactly 18 minutes after Vespra had tied the final knot on the last trash bag. The driveway footage buffered for an agonizing second before snapping into sharp lies nablos. Resolution. The gray, icy sleet from the morning had tapered off, leaving the pavement slick and reflective. The heavy oak front door swung open, and there she was. Vespra, wrapped in her thick wool cardigan, struggling slightly underwater, the immense weight of the first black bag. She dragged it across the wet porch, the plastic catching and stretching dangerously against the brick steps, completely indifferent to the delicate garments being scraped and bruised. Inside, she hoisted it into the trunk of her pristine silver SUV. She returned to the house 3 more times, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her movements brisk and energized. On the final trip, she carried the heavy cardboard box containing my shoes. I watched as she wedged it between two of the garbage bags, slammed the heavy trunk shut, and brushed her hands together. Then, she climbed into the driver's seat. The red taillights flared, illuminating the falling mist, and the SUV backed out of the driveway, disappearing down the tree-lined street. My eyes darted to the timestamp. It was 4:12 p.m. her time. Where does a woman go to permanently erase 10 years of a person's life on a wet Tuesday afternoon? I stared at the frozen frame of the empty driveway, my mind racing through the possibilities. A luxury consignment shop? No, that would leave a paper trail, and Vespera would never risk the humiliation of being caught fencing her daughter-in-law's wardrobe. A charity donation center? Perhaps, but she would have to explain the sheer volume and value of the items if anyone asked questions. Then, a darker, far more realistic thought settled into my bones. She didn't want my clothes to be worn by someone else. She wanted them destroyed. I checked the timeline again. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes later, the silver SUV reappeared on the driveway camera. Vespera stepped out. The trunk popped open, revealing nothing but the dark, empty carpet of the cargo space. She walked back into the house, her posture completely relaxed. A woman who had just successfully amputated a diseased limb and was ready to enjoy a quiet evening with her tea. The clothes were gone. The vintage dresses, the cashmere, my grandmother's delicate shawl, they were permanently, irrevocably gone, tossed into a landfill, incinerated at a local dump, or thrown into an anonymous industrial dumpster behind a strip mall. It didn't matter where they were. What mattered was the absolute finality of her action. My phone vibrated against my palm, shattering the heavy silence of the hotel room. An incoming call. Torin. I stared at his smiling contact photo, a picture I had taken on our anniversary. Trip to the coast, his hair windswept, his eyes full of warmth. A sudden, violent wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a deep, fracturing crack in my foundation. Torin was my bake husband. He was the man who had vowed to protect me, to stand by me. And yet, the very woman who had birthed him had just desecrated my sanctuary under his roof. How could I speak to him? How could I hear his voice and not immediately scream the truth into the receiver? The phone vibrated a fourth time, demanding an answer. I closed my eyes, took a long, shuddering breath, and forced my vocal cords to relax. I swallowed the demony. Bile rising in my throat plastered a smile onto my face even though he couldn't see it. The physical act helped mask the tremor in my voice and swiped the green icon. Hi, darling, I answered, my tone deliberately light, dangerously smooth. There's my brilliant wife. Torin's deep, reassuring voice crackled over the plus. International line. I just wanted to catch you before you went to sleep. How? Was the keynote? Did you tear them apart during the Q&A? It was insightful. I lied effortlessly, staring at the blank wall of my hotel room. A bit exhausting, but I'm holding my own. How are things on the home front? Did the storm cause any power outages? No, we're completely fine. The sleet stopped a few hours ago, Torin replied. I could hear the faint ambient sounds of our kitchen in the background. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of the refrigerator. And then, another sound, the slow, rhythmic dragging of a chair pulling away from the island. Who are you talking to, Torin? It was her voice. Vespera. Faint, but unmistakable. It drifted through the phone. Receiver like a wisp of toxic smoke, curling into my ear and setting every nerve, ending in my body on fire. It's her, Torin said, his voice muffling slightly as he likely pulled the pruded phone away from his mouth. Then, he came back clear. My mother says hello. She wants to know if you're eating properly at that fancy hotel. A hysterical, entirely unhinged laugh bubbled up in the very back of my throat, but I clamped my jaw shut, trapping it inside. The sheer, unparalleled audacity of the woman. She had spent her morning violently purging my existence into industrial garbage bags, and now she was sitting in my kitchen, sipping tea, pretending to care about my dietary habits. It was a level of psychopathy that I had never truly comprehended until this exact moment. "Tell her I'm perfectly fine," I said, my voice dropping an octave, taking on a resonant, hollow quality that Torin, in his infinite blindness, did not seem to notice. "Tell her I am resting well, and I am very much looking forward to coming home." "Will do," Torin said cheerfully. "I miss you. The house feels huge and empty, without you here." "You have no idea how empty it truly is," I thought, my eyes dropping to the phone screen where the security app was running in the background. "I miss you too," I whispered, and to my own shock, it was the only honest thing I had said during the entire conversation. I missed the man I thought I had married. I missed the life I thought I was living before the veil was violently ripped away. "I have an early start tomorrow. I should get some sleep. Good night, my love. See you in 3 days." The line clicked dead. I sat in the silent hotel room, staring at the black screen of my phone until it faded to sleep. 3 days. I had 3 days to navigate the grueling schedule of the conference, 3 days to smile and shake hands, all while carrying a nuclear bomb in my pocket. I did not sleep that night. I laid on top of the covers, watching the digital clock on the nightstand slowly cycle through the hours, meticulously mapping out every single step of my keeling. Return. The remainder of the trip was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I delivered my presentations flawlessly. I engaged in debates. I dined with executives. But inside, I was a hollowed-out shell, functioning purely on the adrenaline of impending vengeance. I barely ate. I avoided looking in the blank effulgence mirror, afraid that the burning intensity in my own eyes would somehow betray the secret I was harboring. Every evening Torin would call. Every evening, Vesper would hover in the background, a lurking shadow of false maternal concern. And every evening, I played the part of the exhausted, oblivious wife to absolute perfection. The true test of my resolve, however, began the moment the plane touched down on the tarmac of my home city. The heavy, metallic thud of the landing gear locking into place felt like a starter pistol firing in my brain. The long, agonizing flight had allowed the Preuss-Lee's daughter Persen, final remnants of my shock to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, impenetrable armor. I gathered my carry-on luggage, offering polite, vacant smiles to the Frein-2, a flight attendants as I disembarked. The air inside the terminal was thick with the familiar, humid scent of my hometown, a stark contrast to the sterile, filtered oxygen of the cabin. Torin was waiting for me at the arrivals gate. He held a small bouquet of white lilies, my favorite, and his face lit up the moment he spotted me in the crowd. He closed the distance between us, wrapping his arms around me in a tight, desperate hug, burying his face in my neck. "God, I missed you," he murmured against my skin, the scent of his familiar cologne washing over me. I hugged him back, squeezing my eyes shut. I wanted to sink into that embrace. I wanted to let go of the tension, to pretend that the last 5 days had been nothing but a fever dream. But the phantom rustle of heavy black plastic echoed in my ears, stiffening my spine. I pulled away slightly, taking the lilies and offering him a soft, manufactured smile. "It's good to be back," I said softly. The drive home was agonizingly slow. The evening traffic was thick, the red brake lights bleeding into the misty rain that had begun to fall, a strange mirror to the storm I had left behind. Torin kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other resting warmly on my knee, chattering excitedly about a new project his firm had secured. I nodded at all the right intervals, offering Hum's kind of agreement, my gaze fixed firmly on the passing streetlights. My pulse was a deafening drumbeat in my ears. We turned onto our street, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. As the sweeping curve of our driveway came into view, the large, multi-generational house loomed against the dark sky like a fortress. Warm, inviting light spilled from the downstairs windows. The porch light was on. It looked like a picture-perfect sanctuary, a sanctuary I knew was built on a foundation of rotting timber and venom. "Home sweet home," Torin sighed happily, shifting the car into park. I unbuckled my seatbelt. My hands were trembling, a fine, almost imperceptible shake that I quickly hid by gripping the handle of my purse. We walked up the Lex Vermating the Sides, brick steps together, Torin turning the key in the heavy oak door. The foyer was warm, smelling faintly of lemon polish and roasted garlic. From The end of the hallway, the kitchen door swung open, and Vespera stepped out into the light. She was wearing a pristine white blouse and a dark tailored skirt. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, not a single strand out of place. She wiped her hands delicately on a dish towel, an expression of utter serene delight plastered across her face. "Welcome back, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness so artificial it tasted like saccharin. She glided across the hardwood floor, leaning in to press a dry, phantom kiss to the air beside my cheek. "You look exhausted. The travel must have been simply dreadful for you." "It was a very long flight," I replied, my voice steady, my eyes locking onto hers. I searched the dark depths of her pupils, looking for a flicker of guilt, a microscopic twitch of nervousness. There was nothing, only the calm, unblinking arrogance of a predator who believes she has successfully devoured her prey without leaving a trace. "Well, I've kept a plate warm for you in the oven," Vespera continued, gesturing graciously toward the kitchen. "Torin tells me you haven't been sleeping well. Perhaps after dinner you should take a hot bath and go straight up to bed. Settle back into your space." The words were carefully chosen. Settle back into your space. She wanted me to go upstairs. She wanted to be downstairs, listening to the silence of the house, waiting for the inevitable, horrified scream to tear through the floorboards. She was anticipating the moment of my breakdown, savoring the impending climax of her cruel theater. "Thank you, Vespera," I said, my lips curling into a smile that did not reach my lithe eyes. "But honestly, I just want to change out of these travel clothes first. I feel completely grimy. A shower and some fresh pajamas sound better than dinner right now." Torin patted my shoulder gently. "Of course. Go on up. I'll bring your suitcase. Do you want me to bring a plate up to the room later?" "That would be wonderful," I said, turning away from them and placing my hand on the smooth, polished wood of the banister. Every step up that sweeping staircase felt like wading through deep water. The silence of the upper hallway was heavy, expectant. The soft carpeting muffled my towel. Footsteps as I approached the master bedroom. I pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed was made, the pillows perfectly fluffed, the lamps on the nightstands casting a warm golden glow across the duvet. But it was the door to the right that held my entire focus. The heavy, frosted, glass door that led into the walk-in closet. I stood in the center of the bedroom, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I knew what was behind that door. I had watched it happen. I had replayed the footage 100 times in the quiet darkness of my hotel room. Yet, the physical reality of it, the anticipation of confronting the empty space with my own eyes, was a terrifying threshold to cross. From downstairs, I heard the faint murmur of voices. Torin and Vespera, casually, chatting in the kitchen. She was waiting. She was holding her breath, waiting for the explosion. I walked slowly toward the closet. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the brushed steel handle. The metal was ice cold. I pressed the latch down, the mechanism clicking sharply in the quiet room, and pushed the door inward. The automatic lights flared on, flooding the massive space with brilliant, unforgiving white light. The scent was the first thing that hit me. The familiar, comforting fragrances of my perfumes, the rich smell of aged leather, the subtle hint of lavender. Sachets, they were completely overpowered by a sterile chemical odor. It smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and raw, exposed drywall. I stepped fully into the room, my eyes sweeping over the devastation. It was worse in person. The video feed had been a sterile top-down perspective, but standing in the center of it, the scale of the violation was suffocating. Every single wooden hanger was gone. The velvet-lined drawers that housed my Ennislost jewelry and lingerie were pulled out slightly, completely hollowed out. The built-in shelving, once a meticulous display of shoes and handbags, was nothing but bare, white wood, stripped of any color or personality. Even the floor, usually covered in the soft, discarded fabrics of my morning rush, had been vacuumed into pristine, terrifying submission. There was nothing left. It was a tomb. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the empty closet ringing in my ears. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees. I simply stared at the pressing, barren walls, feeling the cold, dark energy in the room seeping into my skin, hardening my resolve into something sharp and unbreakable. Vespera wanted a hysterical, weeping victim. She wanted me to run downstairs, sobbing and tearing my hair out, sounding like a paranoid lunatic so she could play the concerned, bewildered mother-in-law. She wanted Torin to see me, completely unhinged. I reached out and ran my fingertips along the edge of a bare shelf. The wood was cold, stripped of its purpose. I would not give her the satisfaction. I turned around, walked out of the closet, and quietly pulled the heavy frosted placid glass door shut behind me until it clicked into place. I walked into the en-suite bathroom, turned on the shower, and stripped off my travel clothes. I stood under the scalding hot water, letting the steam fill the room, meticulously washing the grime of the airport from my skin. When I emerged, wrapped in a thick white towel, Torin was walking into the bedroom, struggling slightly with the weight of my heavy suitcase. He hoisted it onto the luggage rack at the foot of the bed and let out a breathless laugh. "I always forget how many books you pack," he teased, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Are you feeling any better?" "Much better," I said smoothly, walking over to my suitcase and unzipping the sablé. Main compartment. I pulled out a simple pair of soft cotton pajamas I had packed for the trip and slipped them on. Torin sat on the edge of the bed, watching me with a warm, content expression. "My mother heated up some of her famous beef stew for you. She's really gone out of her way to make sure the house was perfect for your return. She even deep cleaned the carpets." "Did she?" I murmured, pulling a comb through my wet hair. I turned to look at him, my expression perfectly neutral. That was incredibly thoughtful of her. Torin smiled, a look of genuine relief washing over his face. He had always hated the subtle tension between us, and to hear me compliment his mother was clearly a victory in his eyes. She means well. She really does. Sometimes her boundaries are a little blurry, but she just wants to help. "I know, Torin," I said softly, walking over to the nightstand and plugging in my phone. The screen illuminated briefly, showing the hidden securities application icon resting innocently on the home screen. "I think I finally understand her perfectly. I'll go grab that plate for you," he said, standing up and kissing my damp forehead. "Don't move. You need to rest." As soon as the bedroom door clicked shut behind him, I sat on the edge of the Preting Alede mattress, staring at the closed closet door. The house was quiet again. The trap was set. Now, I just needed to wait for her to realize that the prey had refused to walk into the snare. The psychological warfare was no longer a one-sided ambush. It was my turn to play. The morning arrived with the suffocating gray light of an overcast sky. I woke. Up precisely at 6, the soft chime of my alarm slicing through the heavy silence of the bedroom. Beside me, Torin was a warm, heavy weight, his breathing slow and even. I slid out of bed with practiced stealth, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, and padded quietly into the en-suite bathroom. I brushed my teeth, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the 90 and the Cares mirror. My eyes were dark, ringed with the faint, bruised shadow of exhaustion, but there was a sharp, dangerous clarity behind them. The game began today. I walked back into the bedroom, bypassing the frosted glass door of the walk-in closet entirely, and went straight to my suitcase, which was still resting on the luggage rack. I pulled out a crisp, white button-down shirt and a tailored, black skirt, the reserve outfit I had packed for the final day of the conference, but never wore. I dressed methodically, smoothing out the wrinkles, and slipped into a pair of simple black flats. I brushed my hair back into a severe, sleek bun, the style I wore when I was preparing for a brutal negotiation. By the time Torin rolled over, groaning softly as he reached for his phone, I was fully dressed and sipping a glass of water by the window. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He squinted at me against the dull light of the window. "You're up early. You look very professional." "I have a massive backlog of emails to catch up on," I said smoothly, setting the glass down. I figured I would get a head start before heading into the dude office. Torin sat up, rubbing a hand roughly over his face. He glanced at the closed closet door and then back at me, a tiny furrow forming between his brows. "You unpacked already? I didn't even hear you go in there." My pulse executed a rapid, violent flutter against the base of my throat, but my dozio said, expression remained an absolute mask of serene indifference. "I just grabbed what was left in my suitcase. I'll unpack the rest tonight." There's no rush. Right. Okay, he said, pushing the covers aside. I'll go start the coffee. My mother is probably already up. I'll be down in 10 minutes, I replied, turning back to the window. The descent down the sweeping staircase felt entirely different this morning. Yesterday, I was walking into an ambush. Today, I was the one holding the person. Detonator. I reached the bottom step and walked down the long, polished hallway toward the kitchen. The smell of freshly ground coffee and toasted brioche hung heavily in the air. I pushed the swinging door open. Vespera was standing at the kitchen island, a delicate porcelain teacup resting in its saucer in front of her. She was reading the morning paper, the crisp, pages folded perfectly in half. Torin was at the counter, pressing the button on the espresso machine. Vespera looked up as the door swung shut behind me. For a fraction of a second, a microscopic, almost imperceptible heartbeat in time, her eyes darted to my pale outfit, then up to my face. She was searching for the redness of swollen eyes. The frantic, erratic energy of a woman who had just discovered her life had been ransacked. She was waiting for the screaming. She was waiting for the accusation. Instead, I offered her a brilliant, radiant smile. Good morning, Vespera, I chimed, my voice light, melodic, and completely devoid of tension. I walked over to the island and pulled out a stool, sitting directly across from her. The coffee smells divine. The silence that followed was thick, viscous, and incredibly heavy. Torin, oblivious to the sudden atmospheric pressure drop in the room, turned around with 2 mugs. Here you go, love, he said, setting a mug in front of me. Thank you, darling, I murmured, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. I took a slow sip, keeping my eyes locked on my mother-in-law over the rim of the mug. Vespera's serene facade rippled. It was a tiny thing, a slight tightening of the perquit, muscles around her mouth, a sudden rigidity in her posture. She slowly lowered the newspaper, her dark eyes narrowing a fraction of an inch. She was confused. The script she had meticulously written in her head, the glorious melodrama she had been anticipating for 5 days, was completely unraveling. Did you sleep well, dear? She asked, her voice tight, the artificial sweetness struggling to mask a sharp, investigative edge. You must have been terribly exhausted. I know how important it is to have your own space when you return from a long journey. She emphasized the word space, throwing it down like a gauntlet. It was a daring move, a subtle prod to force the reaction she so desperately craved. I laughed, a soft, genuine, airy laugh that seemed to echo loudly in the quiet kitchen. I slept wonderfully, thank you. The bed felt amazing after a week in a Protergens hotel. And honestly, I barely noticed the space. I just crashed as soon as my head hit the pillow. Vespera's fingers gripped the edge of her saucer. Her knuckles, usually a pale, powdered white, turned stark and bloodless. She opened her mouth to speak, then snapped it shut, her jaw clenching. The cognitive dissonance was short-circuiting her brain. She knew the closet was empty. She knew it. She had dragged the bags out with her own 2 hands. And yet, here I sat, sipping coffee, entirely unbothered, wearing clothes that I clearly had not pulled from. The barren wasteland upstairs. Torin leaned against the counter, blowing on his espresso. Are you heading straight to the firm today, or are you working from your home office? I think I'll go into the city, I replied, taking a bite of a brioche Torin had sat on a plate between us. There are a few physical files I need to review, and I want to debrief the team while the conference is still fresh in my mind. All right, I'll probably be late tonight. We have a zoning board meeting for the new commercial complex, Torin said, checking his watch. He drained his cup and stepped forward, kissing the top of my head. Have a great day. Call me if you need anything. I will, I promised. He leaned down and kissed his mother's cheek. Bye, Mom. Try not to work too hard on the garden today. The ground is still muddy from the sleet. I will manage, Torin. Have a productive day, Vesper replied stiffly, not taking her eyes off me. Torin grabbed his briefcase from the hall table, the heavy front door clicking, shut behind him a moment later. The sound was a starting bell, signaling the sudden, suffocating isolation of just the 2 of us in the massive house. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The silence stretched, tight, and humming with unspoken violence. Vespera slowly, methodically folded her newspaper, and pushed it aside. She interlaced her fingers on the marble countertop, leaning forward slightly. The pretense of the polite mother-in-law vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating glare of an apex predator, assessing a sudden, confusing threat. "You're wearing your travel clothes again," Vespera noted, her tone conversational but laced with a heavy metallic undercurrent. "Am I?" I asked innocently, glancing down at the crisp white shirt. "I suppose I am. I packed very efficiently for the trip. I find that when you have a wardrobe built entirely on classic, staple pieces, it's so easy to mix and match. Don't you agree?" A muscle in her cheek ticked violently. The mention of my wardrobe, the very thing she believed she had annihilated, was a direct hit to her ego. She stared at me, trying to decipher the puzzle, trying to find the crack in my armor. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the inevitable question. "Where are my clothes, Vespera?" But the question never came. Instead, I stood up, smoothly pushing the stool back. I carried my empty mug to the sink, rinsed it out, and placed it in the dishwasher. I dried my hands on a towel, turning back to face her with an expression of mild, distracted preoccupation. "Well, I should really get going. Traffic on the bridge is going to be a nightmare today," I said, grabbing my purse from the back of a chair. I walked toward the hallway door, pausing just as my hand rested on the brass handle. I turned back, offering her one final brilliant smile. "Oh, by the way, Vespera, the house looks immaculate. You really did a spectacular job deep cleaning while I was away. It feels entirely purged." Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock breaking through her composed mask. It was there and gone in an instant, but I caught it. The use of the word purged was no accident. It was a subtle, psychological tap on the glass of her reality, a tiny hint that perhaps, just perhaps, I knew exactly what she had done. I didn't wait for her response. I walked out the door, the heavy wood swinging shut, leaving her alone in the kitchen with the deafening roar of her own blank confusion. The drive into the city was a blur of adrenaline. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, but an ecstatic, soaring sense of power coursed through my veins. I had seized control of the narrative. By denying her the reaction she desperately needed, I had effectively neutralized her weapon. She was now trapped in a psychological limbo, unable to reveal her own crime, but burning with the frantic need to know why I wasn't screaming. I arrived at my office, a sleek, glass-walled corner suite on the 40th floor of the firm's downtown skyscraper. I closed the door, locked it, and finally, allowed the mask to slip. My breathing hitched, the adrenaline crashing violently, leaving me hollow and shaking. The reality of what I had lost, the vintage silk, the cashmere, the delicate, irreplaceable memory of my Plos. Grandmother's shawl slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. I sank into my leather desk chair, resting my forehead against the cool glass of my desk, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to silently weep for the destruction of my sanctuary. When the 5 minutes were up, I wiped my face, straightened my spine, and unlocked my phone. The security app was still running in the background. I opened it and accessed the saved files. The 45-minute video of Vespera ransacking the closet sat securely in the encrypted cloud. I did not need to watch it again. The images were permanently seared into my retinas. I minimized the app and opened my personal banking application. I navigated to the joint savings account Torin and I maintained for emergencies and large household expenses. It was a substantial sum, built over years of our combined incomes. With a few swift keystrokes, I initiated a transfer, moving exactly half of the balance into a secure, private account in my name only. Torin would receive a notification eventually, but by the time he noticed it, the money would be safely locked away, a financial safety net for the inevitable fallout. Then, I opened a new browser tab and typed in a highly specific search query. For the next 4 hours, I did not review a single legal file or respond to a single corporate email. I was consumed entirely by a meticulous, obsessive hunt. I scoured the dark corners of the internet, scrolling through hundreds of listings, my eyes scanning photographs of fabrics, labels, and intricate stitching. Vespera had taken my history. She had stolen the physical manifestations of my hard work and my heritage. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She believed that by throwing the items away, she had destroyed their value entirely. She did not realize that true value was not in the fabric itself, but in the leverage it provided. I needed to replace a few key pieces, not for myself, but for the theater of the absurd I was about to direct. I found a vintage consignment dealer located in Paris who specialized in mid-century silk. I wired them an exorbitant sum for expedited, overnight, international shipping on a piece that closely mirrored one of the dresses Vespera had destroyed. I contacted a bespoke tailor in London, calling in a favor to have a specific cashmere trench coat meticulously recreated from a photograph I had on my phone, demanding a rush order. The cost was astronomical, draining a significant portion of my newly secured private funds. But the price tag was irrelevant. I was not buying clothes, munitions. By the time the sun began to set behind the jagged skyline of the city, my trap was heavily armed. I packed my briefcase, smoothed my skirt, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive back to the suburbs was slow, the evening traffic thick and sluggish. The rain had returned, a heavy, driving downpour that lashed against the windshield, the wipers thumping rhythmically in the dark cab of the car. I pulled into the sweeping driveway. The house was blazing with light, a massive, glowing beacon against the storm. Torrens' car was not in the driveway. He was still at his zoning board meeting. Perfect. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I shrugged off my wet raincoat, hung it meticulously on the brass hook by the door, and walked toward the kitchen. Vespera was standing by the stove stirring a pot of soup. She turned around as I entered, her posture immediately stiffening. The serene, unbothered mask she had worn this morning was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle tension that radiated from her skin. She looked tired. The mental gymnastics of trying to lawns. I figure out my bizarre behavior had clearly taken a toll on her over the last 10 hours. You're late, she stated flatly, not offering a greeting. Traffic, I replied smoothly, setting my purse on the counter. Is Torren home? Yet? No. He called an hour ago to say the meeting is running long. He told us to eat. Without him, she turned back to the stove, gripping the wooden spoon tightly. I hope you are hungry. I made the vegetable minestrone you usually enjoy. That sounds wonderful, I said, pulling out a stool and sitting down. But before we eat, Vespera, I was hoping you could help me with something. She stopped stirring. The spoon hovered over the pot, a drop of broth falling, with a quiet plop back into the hot liquid. She turned her head slowly, her eyes guarded, heavily suspicious. Help you with what? Well, I said, leaning forward slightly, interlacing my fingers on the cool marble of the counter, mimicking the exact posture she had taken this morning. I went upstairs before I left for the office today to officially unpack my Solcisnaire suitcase. And the most peculiar thing happened. The silence in the kitchen became absolute. The humming of the refrigerator seemed to vanish. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window pane behind her. Vespera's breath hitched, a tiny, almost inaudible catch in her throat. She slowly turned fully toward me, her eyes widening, the anticipation finally breaking through her control. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for all day. The confrontation, the explosion, the glorious climax of her cruelty. Oh, she said, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. She braced herself against the counter, her knuckles turning white. And what was that? I held her gaze, my eyes entirely devoid of emotion, a flat, cold surface, reflecting her own mounting panic back at her. I waited for 3 long, agonizing seconds, letting the silence stretch until it was practically screaming. I couldn't find my green suitcase, I said, my voice completely light, conversational, and entirely unbothered. The small, vintage leather one. The one I usually keep on the top shelf of the closet. Did you happen to move it? When you were cleaning? I really need the documents inside it for a meeting. Tomorrow. Vespera stared at me, her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The cognitive whiplash was violent. She had braced herself for a screaming match about an entire annihilated wardrobe, and instead, I was asking about a single, solitary, insignificant piece of luggage. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a stark, ashen, gray. She looked suddenly very old, very fragile, and entirely terrified. The realization finally hit her, a cold, heavy stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. I wasn't oblivious. I wasn't in denial. I was playing a game, and she had no idea what the rules were. Your green suitcase? Vespera finally managed, the words stumbling awkwardly past her lips. Her voice was thin, reedy, stripped entirely of its usual, commanding resonance. She looked completely unmoored, a captain realizing her, and the ship was taking on water from a breach she could neither see nor access. Yes, the emerald one with the brass clasps, I replied cheerfully, maintaining unbroken, unblinking eye contact. I am absolutely positive I left it on the top rack before I departed for the symposium. It's entirely missing now. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. The mental calculus she was attempting to perform was agonizing to watch. If she admitted to moving the suitcase, she would have to admit to being in the closet. If she denied seeing it, she would force a deeper investigation into a space she knew was a terrifying, barren vacuum. She was backed into a psychological corner, pinned by a single, mundane question about a piece of luggage she hadn't even noticed. During her frantic purge, I am not entirely sure, she stammered, turning back to the stove and frantically stirring the minestrone, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. I did a superficial dusting of the shelves. Perhaps I pushed it too far back, or perhaps Taurine moved it to the attic for storage. I certainly didn't. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to utter a lie that felt so dangerously close to the horrific truth. How strange, I murmured softly, allowing the silence to settle heavily back into the room. I stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt. Well, I suppose I will just have to do a thorough inventory of the closet after dinner. Tear the closet, a whole place apart until I find it. I cannot afford to lose those documents. Vespera froze entirely. The wooden spoon clattered against the side of the metal pot. The prospect of me systematically tearing apart an already empty room, the sheer absurdity and terror of that visual, was the final blow to her composure. I am sure it will turn up, she said, her voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. Take your time, I said pleasantly, turning my back to her and walking toward the hallway. I'm going to head upstairs and start looking. I did not go upstairs. I walked only as far as the heavy oak staircase, pressing my back against the wall, perfectly hidden in the shadows of the foyer. I held my breath, listening intently to the sounds drifting from the kitchen. For 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, I heard the sharp, frantic scrape of a stool being shoved back, the soft, urgent thud of Vespera's orthopedic shoes hurried across the hardwood floor. She was not heading toward the dining room to set the table. She was heading toward the back door. I slipped out of the shadows and crept back to the kitchen entrance, peering carefully around the doorframe. Vespera was standing by the back door, her coat thrown haphazardly over her shoulders, her fingers trembling violently as she struggled with the deadbolt. She yanked the door open and vanished into the rope-in, driving rain, leaving it slightly ajar. I moved quickly, stepping into the kitchen and looking out the window that faced the detached garage. The security light flared on, illuminating the torrential downpour. I watched as Vespera sprinted across the wet pavement, practically throwing herself at the heavy wooden door of the garage. She disappeared inside. My heart hammered a violent, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what she was doing. The panic had finally overridden her logic. She had convinced herself that in her frantic rush to destroy my life, she had accidentally thrown away something of genuine, undeniable importance, the mythical green suitcase. And now, terrified that my impending, thorough inventory would expose the terrifying vacuum of the closet, she was desperately searching the garage, hoping against hope that she had left one of the black trash bags behind. She was looking for the evidence she had already destroyed. I leaned against the counter, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face as I watched the faint glow of a flashlight beam erratically sweeping the interior of the dark garage through the small, frosted window panes. She was freezing, panicked, and entirely at my mercy. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of her own making, and I was holding the conductor's baton. 15 minutes later, the back door creaked open. Vespera stumbled back into the kitchen. She looked horrific. Her pristine white blouse was plastered to her skin, transparent from the rain. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair was plastered, flat against her skull, water dripping continuously from the ends, forming dark, pooling puddles on the hardwood floor. She was shivering violently, her lips possessing a faint, bluish tint. Her hands were empty. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me sitting calmly at the island, reading an article on my phone. "My goodness, Vespera," I gasped, dropping the phone and rushing over to her. With a look of manufactured, horrified concern, I grabbed a dish towel from the counter and draped it aggressively over her wet shoulders. "What on earth happened? Why were you outside in this storm?" She stared at me, her eyes completely wild, the pupils dilated with a mixture of terror and absolute exhaustion. Her teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. I thought I saw the latch on the garage door. I thought the wind had blown it open. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," I scolded gently, leading her toward a stool and pushing her firmly down onto it. "You'll catch pneumonia. Let me get you a hot cup of tea." She sat there, a dripping, broken mess, while I efficiently moved around the kitchen, turning off the stove, pouring a cup of boiling water over a tea bag, and setting it in front of her. She wrapped her trembling, blue-tinged fingers around the mug, not taking her eyes off me. The paranoia radiating from her was almost physical. She was searching my face, desperately trying to find a smirk, a glimmer of malice, a confirmation that this was all a calculated torment. I gave her nothing but the warm, suffocating blanket of genuine, loving concern. The heavy front door clicked open, the sound echoing loudly down the hallway. "Hello? Anyone home?" The traffic was a nightmare. Torrin's voice boomed cheerfully from the foyer. A moment later, he walked into the kitchen, shedding his wet coat. He stopped abruptly, his cheerful expression dissolving into shock. "Mom, what the hell happened to you?" Vespera jumped slightly, startled by his sudden appearance. She looked at her son, her mouth working uselessly, unable to formulate a coherent explanation for why she was sitting in his kitchen looking like a drowned rat. "She went out to secure the garage door in the storm," I interjected smoothly, walking over to Torrin and taking his wet coat from his hands. "I told her it was dangerous, but you know how stubborn she can be about the house. I think she got a bit of a chill." Torrin frowned, walking over to his mother and resting a hand on her soaked shoulder. "Mom, that's ridiculous. You could have slipped on the pavement. You need to go upstairs and take a hot shower right now." Vesper nodded mutely, her eyes still locked on me, a terrified, desperate animal caught in a trap it couldn't comprehend. She stood up shakily, clutching the damp dish towel around her shoulders, and began a slow, agonizingly stiff walk toward the hallway. "Oh, Vespera, wait!" I called out brightly just as she reached the doorframe. She stopped, her spine snapping rigid. She turned her head slowly, looking over, her shoulder with an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. "Don't worry about the green suitcase," I said, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. I found the documents. I had transferred them to my briefcase before I left. I won't need to tear the closet apart after all. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Vespera stared at me, the final, crushing weight of the realization slamming into her. She understood now. She understood the game. She understood that I knew exactly what she had done, and, worse, she understood that I had just manipulated her into standing in a freezing downpour looking for a suitcase that never existed. Her mouth opened, a tiny, ragged gasp escaping her lips, but no words followed. She turned away and practically fled up the stairs, the sound of her wet shoes slapping frantically against the polished wood. "She's getting too old to be doing things like that," Torrin sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he watched her go. He turned to me, pulling me into a warm embrace. "Thank God you're home. You always know how to handle her. Are you okay? You didn't find the closet too? Overwhelming?" My heart skipped a beat. "Overwhelming?" "Yeah," Torrin said, releasing me and walking over to the stove to check the soup. "She told me this morning that she finally cleared out all those massive Cardboard boxes I had stored in the back of your closet from the basement flood. Last year, she said it opened the space up beautifully. I stared at the back of his head, a cold, dark realization settling over me. That was the lie. That was the narrative she had fed him to justify the heavy trash bags and the trips to the driveway. She had claimed she was clearing out his old storage, not destroying my wardrobe. It was a brilliant, airtight alibi. If I had exploded, if I had dragged him upstairs and shown him the empty closet, he would have believed she merely threw away his old college textbooks and broken electronics, completely oblivious to the fact that my life was in those bags. The anger flared hot and bright, but I forced it down, burying it beneath a fake, thick layer of icy resolve. Yes, I murmured softly, walking up behind him and resting my hands on his shoulders. It's much more spacious now. She really did a thorough job. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological attrition. The house became a pressure cooker, the tension so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Vespra had retreated entirely. She rarely left her wing, claiming she had caught a severe cold from her excursion in the rain. When she did emerge, she moved like a ghost, her eyes constantly darting toward me, flinching slightly whenever I entered a room. The arrogant, composed matriarch was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell vibrating with paranoia. I, on the other hand, was glowing. I moved through the house with a light, effortless energy, humming softly as I prepared breakfast, chatting cheerfully with Torin about my workday. I never once mentioned the closet. I never asked where my clothes were. I wore the same 3 outfits in a meticulous, rotating cycle, ensuring that they were always perfectly pressed and styled. Torin, oblivious to the nuance of fashion, noticed nothing. Vespra, watching me from the shadows, noticed everything. The silence regarding the empty closet was driving her insane. She was waiting for the axe to fall, entirely unaware that I wasn't holding an axe. I was holding a scalpel, and I was taking my time preparing the surgical field. On the morning of the 4th day, the first package arrived. It was a Saturday. Torin was in the living room reading a book, and Vespera was sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa, nursing a cup of tea she hadn't touched. In an hour, I was standing by the window, watching the delivery truck pull into the driveway. The doorbell rang, a sharp, piercing sound that made Vespera physically flinch. "I'll get it," I called out brightly, walking to the foyer and pulling open the heavy oak door. The delivery driver handed me a massive, rectangular box, emblazoned with the logo of an exclusive Parisian boutique. I signed for it, hoisted the heavy box into my arms, and carried it into the living room, setting it down directly in the center of the coffee table. Torin lowered his book, raising an eyebrow at the size of the package. "What on earth is that? Did you buy a new piece of furniture?" "No," I laughed lightly, grabbing a brass letter opener from the side table. I glanced at Vespera out of the corner of my eye. Her knuckles were white against her teacup, her gaze locked onto the box with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. "It's a little something I picked up while I was in the city. Yesterday. A replacement, of sorts." I slid the letter opener through the heavy packing tape, the sharp sound tearing. Through the quiet room, I opened the cardboard flaps, pushing aside layers of thick, protective tissue paper. I reached inside and slowly lifted the garment into the air. It was a vintage silk dress, an exact, perfect replica of one of the pieces Vespera had shoved into a trash bag 5 days ago. The rich, emerald green fabric caught the morning light, shimmering with an opulent, heavy sheen. It was exquisite. It was flawless. And it was the most terrifying thing Vespera had ever seen. The teacup slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the saucer with a loud, violent clatter, hot tea spilling over the edge and pooling onto the antique rug. She didn't notice. She didn't move. She just stared at the dress, her face, draining of all color, her eyes wide and completely unblinking. "Wow," Torin breathed, closing his book entirely. "That is stunning. I think I've ever seen you wear something like that before." "Oh, really?" I asked, turning the dress slightly, holding it against my body. I looked directly at Vespera, my smile sharp and cold. "I feel like I've owned something exactly like this before. It just feels so familiar." Vespera's breath hitched, a harsh, jagged intake of air. She knew it was replica. She knew the original was gone, rotting in a landfill somewhere. But the sheer impossible reality of it appearing in my hands, completely, unblemished, broke her reality. The psychological damage of seeing the ghost of the item she had murdered was catastrophic. It's beautiful, Torin said, oblivious to the silent, violent execution. Less happening on his sofa. Are you going to wear it to the charity gala next month? I just might, I purred, carefully folding the dress back into the box. I think it deserves to be seen. For the next 2 weeks, the packages arrived with relentless, devastating frequency. Every few days, a new box would appear on the doorstep. A custom-tailored cashmere trench coat from London. A delicate, hand-embroidered, velvet shawl from a specialty vintage dealer in New York. A pair of pristine Belda leather boots. Each time a box arrived, I made sure Vespera was in the room. I would slowly, methodically unbox the item, holding it up to the light, marveling at its prespool.com beauty, while she sat paralyzed in silent horror, forced to watch the Prada resurrection of the wardrobe she had fought so violently to destroy. The financial cost was staggering, but the psychological toll it took on my mother-in-law was priceless. She stopped eating. She lost weight, the skin around her eyes hollowing out, taking on a bruised, purplish hue. She began to jump at every sound, flinching visibly when the doorbell rang. She was living in a haunted house, surrounded by the spectral remains of her own cruelty. But the true masterpiece of my retaliation was yet to come. The resurrection of the clothes was merely the overture. The grand finale required an audience, a stage, and a level of absolute, undeniable proof that would permanently sever the rotting umbilical cord between Vespera and her son. The perfect opportunity presented itself in the form of Torin's annual, architectural firm dinner party. It was a massive event, held at our house, attended by the firm's senior partners, their spouses, and a handful of prominent city officials. It was the one night a year where Torin's professional and personal lives collided, violently under our roof, and it was the one night where appearances were absolutely everything. The preparation for the party was exhausting. The house was professionally adralda, cleaned, catered food arrived in massive silver warming trays, and a small, string quartet was hired to play softly in the background. Torin was a ball of nervous energy, pacing the floors and checking the ice buckets. Vespera, surprisingly, seemed to rally for the event. The prospect of an audience, of playing the gracious, elegant matriarch to a house full of important people, temporarily overrode her paranoia. She spent the entire afternoon at the salon, returning with perfect hair and a new austere black gown. I spent the afternoon upstairs. I did not wear the new, replacement clothes. I left them hanging in the Pertelsea, pristine, terrifying emptiness of the walk-in closet. Instead, I carefully applied my makeup, securing my hair in an elegant twist. I slipped into a simple, understated navy blue sheath dress, one of the few items I had packed for the conference that survived the purge. Then, I walked over to my desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small, sleek USB drive. The drive contained a single, meticulously edited file. It was a compilation of the security footage from the closet. I had spent hours splicing the footage together, highlighting the most damning, violent moments of Vespera's rampage. I had enhanced the audio, ensuring that the cheerful, upbeat classical melody she hummed while crushing my cashmere was crystal clear. The video was 45 minutes long, but the edited file was a devastating, undeniable 5-minute highlight reel of absolute, sociopathic destruction. I slipped the USB drive into my clutch, took a deep breath, and walked down the stairs to welcome the guests. The party was in full swing by 8 o'clock. The house was filled with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the soft, elegant strains of the string quartet. Torin was holding court in the center of the living room, surrounded by partners, laughing loudly at a joke. Vespera was in her element. She was gliding through the crowd, offering polite smiles, subtly taking credit for the floral arrangements and the catering choices. She looked radiant, the hollow, paranoid woman from the last 3 weeks completely vanishing under the spotlight of social approval. I watched her for a long moment, feeling the cold, hard weight of the USB drive in my clutch. The time for subtle psychological warfare was over. It was time to Burn the house down. I walked over to the massive 70-inch flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace in the living room. Torin used it primarily for streaming, architectural presentations during meetings at the house, so it was already hooked up to a sophisticated, high-definition soundbar system. I slipped the USB drive into the hidden port behind the screen. I picked up the remote control, casually turning my back to the screen as I navigated the menu, ensuring the source input was set to the drive. My heart was completely calm. The adrenaline that had fueled me for the last 3 weeks had settled into a deep, freezing stillness. I caught Torin's eye across the room and smiled, holding up a finger to signal that I was about to speak. He immediately clapped his hands together, raising his voice over the noise of the crowd. "All right, everyone, if I could just have your attention for a moment," Torin announced cheerfully, raising his champagne glass. The string quartet stopped playing, and the low hum of conversation gradually faded into an expectant silence. "My beautiful wife has a few words she'd like to share before we bring out the dessert course." All eyes turned to me. Vespera, standing near the doorway to the dining room, offered a polite frozen smile, her posture rigid. She assumed I was going to give a standard gracious host speech, thanking everyone for coming. She had no idea she was about to star in the main event. "Thank you, Torin," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "And thank you all for being here tonight. It is always such a joy to open our home to the people who mean so much to my husband's career." I paused, letting the polite murmurs of agreement settle. I looked directly at Vespera. The smile on her face faltered slightly, a tiny flicker of unease flashing in her dark eyes. "A home is a sanctuary," I continued, my tone shifting, growing softer, more resonant. "It is a place where we should feel entirely safe, where our history and our belongings are respected." For a long time, I believed this house was that sanctuary. But unfortunately, while I was away at the symposium last month, I learned a very hard, very devastating truth about the fragility of trust. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The polite smiles vanished, replaced by looks of confusion and sudden discomfort. Torin frowned, taking a step toward me, his hand reaching out slightly. "Darling, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with a sudden, rising panic. "I am talking about the importance of security, Torin," I said firmly, not breaking eye contact with his mother. "I am talking about the absolute necessity of knowing exactly who you share your home with." Vespera's face drained of all color. The glass of champagne in her hand trembled so violently the liquid splashed over the rim, staining the pristine carpet at her feet. She knew. The terrifying, impossible realization hit her with the block. Force of a physical blow. She didn't know how, she didn't know what I had, but she knew the execution was happening now, in front of an audience she valued more than life itself. I didn't wait for her to react. I pressed the play button on the remote control and stepped away from the screen. The massive flat-screen television flared to life, casting a brilliant, harsh, white glow across the dimly lit living room. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Sterile, top-down view of my meticulously organized, pre-destruction walk-in closet. The guests stared at the screen, a collective wave of absolute confusion rippling through the crowd. Torin stopped dead in his play tracks, his eyes darting from the television to me, his mouth slightly open. Then, the audio kicked in. It was loud. The sophisticated soundbar system projected the sudden, aggressive rustle of a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag with terrifying clarity. The Cartesian sound tore through the elegant, hushed atmosphere of the living room like a physical assault. Vespera stepped into the frame. A sharp, collective gasp echoed from the assembled guests. The senior partners, their spouses, the city officials, all of them watched in paralyzed, horrified silence as the elegant, composed matriarch of the household, the woman who had just been graciously accepting compliments on the floral arrangements, was suddenly displayed on a massive screen, violently yanking a delicate vintage silk dress from its hanger. What is this?" Torin stammered, his voice cracking, a raw, desperate sound that barely pierced the deafening audio of the video. He stared at the screen, his face draining of blood, unable to comprehend the visual evidence of his mother's sociopathy. On the screen, Vespera bunched the silk fabric into her fists, crushing it mercilessly before shoving it deep into the black garbage bag. The audio, captured her cheerful, upbeat humming perfectly. It was a sickening brow sting. Juxtaposition, the lilting, happy melody playing over the calculated destruction of thousands of dollars worth of property. "Turn it off!" Vespera shrieked. The sound of her voice in the living room was entirely different from the plucidar, cheerful humming on the screen. It was a feral, desperate wail. She lunged forward, her champagne flute shattering against the hardwood floor, dropping her. Mask entirely. She wasn't an elegant host anymore. She was a cornered animal. "Turn it off immediately! This is a fabrication! This is a trick!" she screamed, her hands flying to her face as if she could physically block the projection of her own crime. I didn't move. I simply stood by the fireplace, the remote control held loosely. In my hand, my posture relaxed, my expression a mask of cold, unyielding stone. I watched Torin. The video cut to the next clip. Vespera was now targeting the cedar shelves. The camera caught the exact moment she lifted my grandmother's delicate, hand-embroidered velvet shawl from its archival box. "No," Torin whispered, the single syllable escaping his lips like a dying breath. He recognized the shawl. He knew the history, the sentimental value. He had held me the night my grandmother passed away, wrapping that very fabric around my shoulders. He watched, completely paralyzed, as his mother, a cruel, mocking smile twisting her features, balled the priceless family heirloom up like a piece of dirty ages laundry and tossed it into the trash bag. The silence in the living room was absolute, suffocating terror. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The guests were trapped in a horrifying social nightmare, unwilling witnesses to the total destruction of a family. The only sound was the high-definition audio of the plastic bags tearing, the hangers clattering, and Vespera's incessant, cheerful humming. "Torin, don't look at it! It's a lie!" Vespera cried, rushing toward her son and grabbing his arm frantically. "She set me up. She's trying to ruin me." Torin slowly, mechanically turned his head to look at his mother. His eyes were entirely blank, a hollow, shattered emptiness replacing the warmth and trust that had lived there for a lifetime. He looked down at her hands gripping his sleeve, and then he looked back up at the screen. The final clip played. It was the sweeping shot of the barren, stripped walls. The closet was dead. Vespera stood in the center of the frame, wiped her hands, together in a gesture of absolute triumph, and smiled at her handiwork. The screen faded to black. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I Prawnit had ever experienced. I slowly raised the remote and turned the television off. The room plunged back into the soft ambient lighting of the lamps, but the atmosphere was irreparably broken. "A trick?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I turned to look at Vespera, who was still clutching Torin's arm, her chest heaving, tears of absolute panic streaming down her face. "Tell me, Vespera, how does one fabricate 45 minutes of continuous security footage? How does one artificially generate the exact clothes you threw into the trash? How does one fake the profound sociopathic joy on your face as you destroyed the only blank things in this house that truly belong to me?" "You're insane!" she spat, spit flying from her lips, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You set a camera in your own home. You spied on me. You invaded my privacy." "Your privacy?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "You walked into my bedroom while I was thousands of miles away, stripped my entire existence from the walls, and threw it into a dumpster. And you have the absolute audacity to speak to me about privacy?" I turned to the guests. They were standing awkwardly, some looking at the floor, others staring at me with expressions of profound pity and shock. "I apologize for the disruption to the evening," I said clearly, my voice steady. "But I could not, in good conscience, allow this woman to stand in my home, eat the food paid for by my income, and play the gracious host to my husband's colleagues, while she actively attempts to erase my existence. The party is over." Nobody argued. The exodus was immediate and entirely silent. The senior partners grabbed their spouses' arms, making a rapid, uncomfortable retreat toward the repit foyer to collect their coats. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody offered platitudes. They simply fled the burning building. Within 5 minutes, the house was empty, save for the three of us. Torin finally moved. He slowly pulled his arm out of his mother's frantic grip. He walked over to the coffee table, picked up a crystal decanter of whiskey, and poured himself a glass, his hands shaking so violently the glass clinked against the crystal. He downed the liquor in one gulp, the amber liquid burning down his crystal throat. He didn't look at me. He looked at Vespera. "Torin," she sobbed, holding her hands out to him, her voice entirely stripped of its usual authority, reduced to the pathetic begging of a cornered coward. "You have to understand." She was taking over. The house was supposed to be ours. She was changing things. Her clothes, her things, they were everywhere. It was suffocating me. I just wanted to make some space. I just wanted our home back. Torin stared at her, the final, agonizing pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The missing heirloom necklace 6 months ago. The constant, subtle, belittling. The lie about clearing out his college storage boxes. The sheer, terrifying reality that his mother was not a difficult woman, but a malicious, destructive force masquerading as a victim. "You threw away everything she owned," Torin said, his voice a hollow, raspy whisper. "You threw away her grandmother's shawl. You lied to my face." "She provoked me," Vespera screamed, abandoning the begging and reverting to her default mechanism of blame. "She flaunted her money. She paraded those ridiculous clothes around like she owned the place. She disrespects me in my own home." "It is not your home," I stated flatly, stepping away from the fireplace and walking toward her. Vespera flinched, taking a step back as I approached. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. She was no longer the matriarch. She was an exposed, cornered trespasser. "My name is on the deed, Vespera," I continued, my voice low, dangerous, and entirely uncompromising. "My income pays the mortgage. My income paid for the clothes you destroyed. And my income paid to aggressively, meticulously replace every single item you threw into a landfill over the last 3 weeks just to watch you squirm." Vespera gasped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The mysterious packages. The emerald silk dress. It wasn't a haunting. It was a calculated, expensive psychological torture, and she had fallen into the trap entirely. You bought them back just to torture me?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "No," I replied coldly. "I bought them back to prove that you cannot erase me. You took fabric, Vespera. You took threads. You did not take my power, but the game is over now. The audience has seen exactly who you are." I turned to Torin. He was still holding the empty whiskey glass, staring at his mother with an expression of profound, irreparable disgust. "Torin," I said softly, dropping the harshness from my voice, "I love you, but I cannot and will not live under the same roof as a woman who actively attempts to destroy me. The choice is yours, but it must be made tonight." Torin didn't hesitate. The absolute devastation of the video, the undeniable proof of his mother's cruelty, had completely severed the bond. The willful ignorance he had maintained for years was shattered beyond repair. He set the glass down on the table, a heavy, final sound. He looked at Vespera, his eyes entirely dead. "Pack your things," he said, his voice quiet, carrying the weight of an absolute finality. Vespera let out a wail, a horrific, gut-wrenching sound that echoed through the wail. Massive, empty house. She fell to her knees, clutching at Torin's pant legs, sobbing uncontrollably. "Torin, please, you can't do this. I am your mother. Where will I go? I have nothing. You can't throw me out like garbage." "You seem to be perfectly comfortable throwing things out like garbage, Torin," replied coldly, physically stepping back to break her grip on his clothing. "You have until tomorrow morning. If you are not gone by 10 o'clock, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing and destruction of property. I am entirely serious." He didn't wait for her response. He turned his back on the sobbing woman on the sime floor, walked past me without a word, and headed up the stairs. I stood in the center of the living room, looking down at Vespera. She was a broken, pitiful mess, weeping onto the expensive Persian rug, completely stripped of her dignity, her power, and her son. The war was over. I had won. But as I stood there, listening to the pathetic sounds of her grief, I realized something profound. The victory felt cold. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind an exhausting, hollow emptiness. I had secured my sanctuary, I had exposed the monster, but the foundation of my home was forever cracked. I walked past Vespera, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the bling, hardwood floor, entirely ignoring her frantic pleas. I climbed the sweeping staircase, the air feeling lighter, the oppressive tension that had suffocated. The house for 2 years finally lifting. I walked into the master bedroom. Torrin was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a single tear tracking down his cheek. "I am so sorry. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it." I walked over to him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, it's over. Now." I moved past him, pushing open the heavy frosted glass door of the walk-in closet. The automatic lights flared on, illuminating the space. The brilliant replacement garments hung on the racks, a defiant, expensive protest against the emptiness that had been forced upon the room. The vintage silk, the custom cashmere, the perfectly recreated velvet shawl, they were all there, beautiful and untouched. But as I looked at them, I knew the truth. They were replacements. They were beautiful, but they lacked the history, the scent of jasmine, the memory of the present, promotions, and the late-night celebrations. The original pieces, the physical timeline of my survival were gone forever. I reached out and ran my fingers over the sleeve of the emerald silk dress. The fabric was cold. Vespera was leaving tomorrow. She had lost her home, her son, and her dignity. She would spend the rest of her life in a small, rented apartment, haunted by the public humiliation of the video. The punishment fit the crime perfectly. But the scent of an empty room lingers long after the space has been refilled. The ghosts of the stolen garments would always haunt the corners of the closet, a silent, perpetual reminder of the day my sanctuary was violated. I pulled the heavy frosted glass door shut, turning off the lights, and stepped back into the quiet bedroom, ready to begin the agonizing, slow process of building a new history on the ashes of the old.